Good morning, brothers. Today I'm going to speak about meta-symbolism in Moby Dick. Don't look for that word in the dictionary. You're not going to find it. It's a word that I myself coined, meaning that there's a symbolism beyond symbolism. Let me begin with this introduction. Great classical works can appeal us in many different ways. And at some point, I felt annoyed when somebody tried to read Antigone from a Freudian perspective, or when they tried to read the Aeneid from a fascist perspective, right? Fascism, Freudian readings, I'm not so much in tune with that, and I thought that they were trying to impose their own preconceived schemes into the book. But eventually I realized this is completely natural. We all relate to the books in our own particular way. And I myself have read this book and I've been able to relate to it in several ways. So I think that instead of getting annoyed at those readings, we should rather estimate and value the depth of these works that can touch something that is deeply human, and regardless of our religious beliefs or our political orientation or the time we're living in or our culture, we can always relate to these works. And I think one of these great works is precisely Moby Dick. Moby Dick is something very valuable, and I think that one of the reasons why it's so valuable, it's because Moby Dick is not only a symbol. Moby Dick is a symbol of the symbol. And that is why it can be read from so many perspectives. To give you just an insight into how wide this range is, who's the whale? Is it God? Some have read Moby Dick as if God is the whale and Captain Ahab is the devil himself. And there are many divine attributes that are credited to the whale, just like there are many demonic attributes credited to Captain Ahab. There's also some kind of satanic ritual he performs. So that's a very accurate reading. However, some others have seen Captain Ahab as a symbol of man and the whale itself as a symbol of evil. So is it a struggle between God and the devil, or is it a struggle between man and the evil one? And both of those readings are appropriate because the text can be read and can be interpreted in those various ways. So let me start sharing my own experience. The first time I came across Moby Dick, it spoke to me very eloquently about how destructive obsession can be. When you become obsessed with a project, with an endeavor, with an undertaking, whatever it be, a campaign, an academic work, a business, if you become obsessed, not only are you going to be destroyed, you are going to destroy everything that is around you. And that was the first insight I got into Moby Dick. When I went back to the text, it spoke to me in a different way. I think by then I was already more familiarized with the romantic ideal. And we can see Captain Ahab as the romantic hero. A romantic hero that leads his crew to a glorious death. And you can see that something as something that was also very present in that time. That was the time of the revolutions. Not only in Europe, you can also think about the Mexican independence or the defense of the Chapultepec castle with the Niños Héroes, right? That happened just 3 years before this book was written. And you can think of these heroes defending their homeland against a foreign invader, and they were completely powerless. But nonetheless, that was a glorious fight. And that was my second reading, but I had not finished crystallizing this reading when another reading came upon that one. And Why shouldn't we read this just like a pathetic criticism of that romantic ideal? Captain Ahab is obsessed, but the whale doesn't even bother to kill him. He's just dragged. And I started reading the book from that other perspective. Maybe this is a criticism of the romantic ideal. So you can see these two contrasting readings of the book. You can see it as a romantic and as an exaltation of the romantic ideal, or you can see it as a reviling of the romantic ideal. And you can read it from any perspective you want. And then a very personal reading, a reading that has to do a lot with my own philosophical work, and it's completely my own. See the Pequod as the human person. In the human person, we humans, we have passions, we have an intellect, we have a will. And for me, Captain Ahab is the symbol of the will. He says he doesn't think. Who thinks? Who's the symbol of the intellect? Starbuck, exactly. And we see this conflict between the will and the intellect, and who prevails? The will. Captain Ahab prevails. And of course, that's completely personal. That's the way I read it. And if I have entitled myself to giving my own personal interpretation, why should I prevent anyone else from giving their own interpretation? That is why this book, I think, is so rich, because you can interpret from a very wide multiplicity of perspectives. Now I ask you again, Captain Ahab is the will, Starbuck is the intellect. Who prevails? It doesn't matter. From Melville's Calvinistic perspective, we create a drama within ourselves, and the drama of human freedom. But for him, or for Calvinism at least, freedom is a mere illusion. And we deceive ourselves thinking we are free, when in the end, we are doomed. So this can also be read as a book of doom. The Pequod is a crew, is the ship. But what is the Pequod? Where does the ship take its name from? From an ancient Native American tribe that was extinct. So from the outset, the ship was doomed to be extincted, to sink. Of course, we've seen it throughout Romanticism. It can also be read as a symbol of nature. So man's struggle with nature. Although in Leopardi we had nature as this stepmother that was cruel, here we have it rather as an impersonal force who doesn't even bother to crush us. Nature just follows its course. And then it has also given rise to a lot of political commentaries. You can say that Mark Twain is probably the author who best describes American society, but nonetheless, Herman Melville's foundational value is unquestionable. America is to a significant extent founded on Herman Melville's Moby Dick, or at least he delineates American values and the outset. Both of his grandfathers had fought in the Revolutionary War, and you can read Moby Dick as a symbol of American society, where all ethnicities and all social classes come together. You can see that there are also a lot of conflicting ideas, just like in our days. And I think Herman Melville could foresee what would explode just a few years after this book was published, the American Civil War. We can also see the Pequod as a symbol of the US traveling around the world and gaining from around the world resources for the homeland. Some have seen in Captain Ahab the symbol of liberalism and individualism. And he's opposing what is inexorable. Although some others have seen Captain Ahab not as the individual, but as the politician. So you see, again, two conflicting interpretations, and they are both accurate. So you can see Captain Ahab as the politician who leads his country to doom, or you can see Captain Ahab as the individual who's opposing the state that now will be symbolized with a whale. Look, I brought you a whale. What can we say about this whale? It sheds light. And in the time of Herman Melville, how could you make light? There was not electricity was something just incipient. So you needed whale oil. So the whale literally is that which sheds light upon the world. And there's a passage in Moby Dick where Herman Melville says, or the narrator Ishmael says, whenever you light up a candle or a lamp, remember that there's blood in it, because it was also a very dangerous undertaking. And it can also be described as a philosophical quest that comes to a tragic end, because we are trying to put the pieces together. We're trying to make sense of existence, and that is doomed. So it can also be seen as a as a philosophical commentary and as a quest for knowledge. Let's move on. It can also be seen as a symbol of the sacred or the mystery. What do I mean? That which is sacred cannot be depicted. When it's in its own element, which is the water, the whale is invisible. When you bring it ashore, it's deformed. So when we try to approach the sacred mystery, either it remains invisible, or when we bring it to our own structures, we disfigure it. The whale can be seen as a symbol of the sacred mystery that is unapproachable. Besides, Captain Ahab is crippled. We stand only on one leg when we approach the sacred, because there is no solid grip for us. Right? We don't stand our ground when we approach the mystery. It's also white. What does white mean? It's the absence of color, or is it all colors combined? Okay, I'm gonna leave it here. So, does it bring all colors together, or is it the absence of color? There's a passage that seemed irreverent to me, but eventually I started reading it from that perspective, and I said, okay, I grant it. He quotes the passage from the Bible where God says, "You will not see my face, you will only see my back." That's what the whale says. Because when the whale is in the water, we never see its face. Actually, the whale has no face. What can we see? Only its tail. So that's the mystery. That's the sacred mystery that is never fully grasped. You can also read Moby Dick like a commentary on art, aestheticism, and beauty. Beauty is that which we are all pursuing, and we can never fully grasp it. So the artist is trying to depict something that is foreign to him, and he's trying to bring it into the light of the world, but that remains always hidden, and he has to acknowledge that that which he gets to share is only fragmentary. You can also see it as love. Just like Captain Ahab was obsessed with the whale, we all, in some way or another, are in pursuit of love, right? But isn't love something that becomes elusive many times, and something we chase maybe madly, but we can never fully grasp? And I'm not saying true love doesn't exist, but whenever something comes in the way or a heartbreak happens, we find this same mystery, this same love story that has failed. And I think that's also a very powerful reading of Moby Dick. Or you can see it, you can see the whale as a symbol of emotion or suppressed emotions or the subconscious. Why? Because it's something that we are trying to chase, but it's something that we can never fully grasp, and at the same time, it can be very destructive. Finally, before I finish, let me just mention that several authors have also read Moby Dick in an autobiographical way. Herman Melville is speaking about his own life. And of course, he himself went on a whaling voyage, right? But maybe he put in the book way more than he himself realized. What does this mean? Call me Ishmael. In the Bible, who's Ishmael? He's an orphan who was raised by his mother. And the same thing happened to Herman Melville. Herman Melville was also in quest of something, and he was a wanderer. Ishmael is a wanderer, even more than Ulysses in the Odyssey, because at least Ulysses has a fatherland and has a wife to come back to. Ishmael doesn't even have that. So Herman Melville himself considered himself a wanderer. Besides, his biographers also state that Herman Melville was an abusive father who vexed his family frequently. And although he penned Captain Ahab after the figure of King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, many say that he put too much of himself in Captain Ahab. Finally, have you read the introduction to Moby Dick? He comes with a long list of etymologies. Here I have a vintage edition of Moby Dick, and he speaks about the whale, beginning with the book of Genesis. And God created the great whales, the book of Genesis. And he goes through several pages quoting Hamlet, quoting King Henry, Lord Byron, and several other authors and books from a very wide span of time. And after many pages, he signs a sub-librarian. What does that mean? I am an erudite. I am a very learned person, but I am not recognized. I am only a sub-librarian. When the novel finishes, is something solved? Nothing is solved. And that can also be seen as a symbol of senselessness. We are looking for some meaning. We are trying to make sense of things, and in the end, nothing is solved. But nonetheless, Ishmael and the reader are still afloat. And that's our experience. Even when things don't make sense, life goes on. So I hope these insights were helpful, and I'm not trying to be exhaustive. I think that you can read Moby Dick from a very wide range of perspectives, and I hope you can relate to it. So I think it's a very powerful book precisely because of its symbolism, or how I call it, it's meta-symbolism. For me, Moby Dick is a symbol about the symbol. Thank you.